Thank you. Well, thank you, David, Jennifer, for having me here. And we're going to start out with my first and last commercial. The presentation that I'm going to give you are taken from 5 books. They're up here on the screen: Reich of the Black Sun, The SS Brotherhood of the Bell, Secrets of the Unified Field, The Philosopher's Stone, and the 5th book in the series that deals with this project is called The Nazi International. So that's my first and last commercial. Now, for those of you taking notes, this is the 3 major points in the outline. I'm going to be talking basically about 3 things: the general context in Nazi secret weapons projects, just to kind of give you where the Bell Project is and why it is so extremely important to understanding the kind of physics that Dr. Brandenburg was talking about in his presentation. Then I'm going to talk in the second part about the Nazi Bell itself. What exactly was it? What were they trying to do with this device? And then in the third project, the all-important question of where exactly did this thing go? What you're not going to be hearing about in the first part of the presentation is going to be what I'll start with first in that first topic point. And then the second part of it, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what I call a very sobering arsenal, and I'm borrowing Nick Begich's phrase here. He calls some of these technologies the first revolution in military affairs, and as we're going to see, that revolution really begins in Nazi Germany prior to and during World War II. And then I'm going to talk about the implications of it. All right, so what you're not going to be hearing about in my presentation: you're not going to be hearing about secret Nazi UFO bases in Antarctica. You're not going to hear about Admiral Byrd and Operation High Jump, because as Dr. Brandenburg mentioned very briefly in his presentation, the electrical power requirements for the type of physics that the Nazis were investigating were so enormous that they literally had to build a power plant where they were testing this Bell device. So doing this type of research in Antarctica was absolutely out of the question for them. And the other problem is if they had a base there, it's most likely for U-boat operations of some sort. The construction of a sophisticated research base in Antarctica, in my opinion, would have been too difficult for the German Navy, given that it's already involved in extensive wartime operations. The second thing I'm not going to be talking about is I'm not going to be talking about Nazi flying saucers, the alleged flying saucers Haunebu and Vril that some of you may have heard about being written or talked about by other authors or written about in magazines and so on. The reason why is that I regard those stories as a bit of spurious disinformation, because if you track the sources of these stories back to their original sources, those sources all end up being a narrow circle of neo-Nazis that are active in and around Vienna and then Munich in Bavaria in Germany. So the sources themselves have not ever really been corroborated, so I'm not going to be talking about those. I'm also not going to be talking to you or trying to convince you that the Nazis mounted secret expeditions to the moon and Mars during the war. That was a myth that was out there for some time in the 1980s and 1990s. And quite frankly, this is a story that was circulated by the same group of post-war neo-Nazis. And finally, I am not going to be talking about alleged UFO crashes in Germany prior to the war, from which the Nazis were able to back-engineer their projects. Because first of all, there is no solid evidence forthcoming that such events ever took place. And secondly, the technology and physics that are evident in the Bell device can be entirely rationalized on the basis of science papers that were published in Germany between the wars And thirdly, the Bell project actually may have begun even as early as 1924, before the Nazis ever really took power, and long before such alleged events ever took place. You know, I tease people that always want to go to the crash and recovery explanation for some of this advanced technology, that if E.T. keeps crashing his advanced and sophisticated technology on the Earth, at some point we're going to have to start crashing our technology on his planet so that he can catch back up with us, okay? All right, so let's get started with the actual presentation itself. I've got notes on my little sheets here that you don't see, so I have to kind of refer to these from time to time to make sure I tell you about everything. On May 8th, the day that the Third Reich actually surrenders, Nazi Germany had invented virtually all of the component weapons systems and military doctrines of modern warfare, and had even deployed some of them. From jet fighters, here you see a Messerschmitt 262 that became operational in 1944. And the bad news is, folks, is that Adolf Hitler, when he first saw this plane fly in 1941, said that he wanted it to be a bomber. So that delayed the production of this fighter, which could have entered service operationally as early as 1942. So if you can imagine, had that happened, our piston engine fighters would have been confronted with something that was, for the Allies at least, still on the drawing board, and wouldn't actually enter Allied service until after the war was over in 1946. That's how far ahead they were in terms of aeronautics. To primitive cruise missiles, here you see a V-1 buzz bomb being air-launched by a Heinkel 111 medium bomber. To mobile ballistic missiles and launching systems. And this is really interesting. To mobile over-the-horizon phased array radars. Now, why is that so significant? It's significant because a phased array radar uses several antennas to interfere the radio signal and thus bend it over the curvature of the Earth. So in other words, if you're going to be developing long-range rockets, at least at that time, and have a means of guiding them to targets, you have to have something like this in your technology tree. And of course, the target that they're developing all this for is us. To second-generation digital computers. This is a computer that was operational in the Deutsche Reichspost. It was designed by a German engineer by the name of Konrad Zuse. It was operational in the Deutsche Reichspost about 1943. This computer, incidentally, had about the same computing power as the post-war American ENIAC computer, and it was about half the size. Now that's significant because, we'll get to it in a moment, they also had developed and deployed during the war infrared night sight vision on some of their tanks. Here you see a Panther medium tank, a bad piece of work to begin with if you happen to run into one, with an infrared sight. These were actually deployed, a battalion of them were deployed during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. We had the unfortunate circumstance to run into a bunch of these things with this night sight, and you can imagine the predictable results. Now look at this. This is a German television camera that was used during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And as you probably know, many of you have probably seen the movie Contact. It actually begins with the contact beaming back to Earth, the television signal of Hitler on television giving the opening address to the Munich Olympics there in Berlin. But as you can see from this photo, this television camera is a rather large and clunky affair. But by the end of the war, the Germans had been successful in miniaturizing that television camera to something that could fit in a little bit larger than a shoebox. Now, all that implies, the computer I showed you, the television camera, and this little miniature shoebox camera, television camera, implies a tremendous degree of electronic miniaturization that took place during World War II, and that requires this. These are little German semiconductor wafers that were produced circa 1940 to 41. These were photographs taken by Allied intelligence teams that went into the Reich at the end of the war, specifically with the purpose to gather up all of this German technology and to transfer it to the West, to Great Britain, to the United States, and then, of course, to France. But semiconductor chips are interesting because they are an essential component in the technology tree that leads to the transistor. So look at this. This is a little miniature vacuum tube. It's a kind of a vacuum tube called a Klystron tube. This was produced by the German firm of Telefunken, and it was already in use in Germany in 1940 and became common in little, almost transistorized radios, small little radios that were produced in Germany beginning in 1941. This tube is about as big as the last knuckle on your little finger, and it's in use in 1941. The American and British equivalent of that tube at the end of the war was 10 times larger. So they are making tremendous and leaping bounds in the miniaturization of electronics. And obviously the purpose is they're reducing as much of the weight that they can on their rockets, and for a very significant purpose. Because if you're going to wed atomic bombs to your rockets, A-bombs back then are very heavy pieces of machinery. So this is all being very deliberately and carefully rationalized by the Nazis in order to make all of their advanced technology practically feasible. Now, just as a little aside, this is very interesting to me. You all may remember during the first Gulf War the various press conferences that were given by General Norman Schwarzkopf, where they would show you television camera footage from American and British smart bombs being unerringly guided with precision to Iraqi bunkers and blowing them up. I remember one very famous conference where General Schwarzkopf had noticed this Iraqi man running across a bridge as one of these smart bombs is being guided to blow up this bridge. And of course it hits dead on the bridge. Well, look at this. This is television camera footage from a 1945 test of a German surface-to-air missile called Tonne. It was tested in March of 1945. And look at the frames. Here you see one, and way off in the distance, kind of blurry in the background, you see an old derelict ship. That's frame 2, you're a little closer. Frame 3, and frame 4, you're right on top of it. 1945. Now this is really interesting to me, because I had originally considered this idea for my book Reich of the Black Sun and rejected it because I could not find proof. And the idea was, it's been circulated for many years, is that the Nazis may have actually been working on lasers. And then I found this document. This document is really a memorandum that's drawn up by some unnamed German scientist who is going to be briefing a Luftwaffe field marshal on a secret project that so far has been successful. And if you read the talking points in this memorandum, what he's doing is he is making the pitch to this Luftwaffe field marshal that they now need to scale the project up, go full bore, and make it work. But right down here, in point number 17, the very bottom point, this scientist uses the phrase Kaskadenprinzip, or in English, cascade principle. Now, friends, in the 1940s, the term laser didn't exist, but the physics for it did. And the precise principle on which a laser works is precisely the principle of photon cascade. And that's exactly what you find the German scientists writing about at that time. And that's exactly what you see this scientist talking about in this memorandum. Now, I can't in such a short time go over the case that I make in the book The Philosopher's Stone, that part of what they're doing with these lasers is that they are using lasers for enrichment and separation of radioactive isotope. It's a very sophisticated, very efficient technique of isotope separation and enrichment, laser isotope enrichment. And it doesn't become public knowledge, really, until the 1970s and early 1980s. But I can assure you that there is documentation that exists that the German scientists had figured out that if they could come up with a tunable laser, in other words, a laser that they can tune to different frequencies of light, and beam it through gaseous radioactive material, that they could enrich it to far greater purity than any other method known at that time. And I believe, incidentally, that this was all being conducted and done by the German firm of I.G. Farben. Many of you have probably heard of that firm, okay? So in other words, I am arguing the case that the Germans probably had a prototype technology during World War II that was 30 years in advance of any enrichment technology known to or even thought of by the Western Allies. And that means in turn that their atomic bomb program was much more sophisticated, much more advanced, and ultimately, as I argue in the first book in this series, Reich of the Black Sun, much more successful than the legend that we have been taught and told. Now bear that point about the A-bomb and the possibility that the Nazis were actually successful in getting it. Bear that point in mind, because it will become very important in a moment. One document that I found that was discovered by U.S. intelligence agents as they went into Nazi Germany referred to a project that the Germans were conducting that was had something to do with what they were calling optical telephony, okay? Which, given the fact that we have a 1944 Luftwaffe document talking about actual laser testing being done in Germany, indicates that the Germans may have actually been thinking of or working along the lines of fiber optics, because again, this is a necessary step in the technology tree. So what are the implications of what I'm telling you? I want to read a passage from Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, which most of you are probably familiar with. And listen very carefully to what he says. Quote, "Today, items such as lasers, integrated circuitry, fiber optics networks, accelerated particle beam devices, and even the Kevlar material in bulletproof vests are all commonplace. Yet, the seeds for all of them were found in the crash of the alien craft at Roswell. In those confusing hours after the discovery of the crashed Roswell alien craft, the Army determined that in the absence of any other information, it had to be an extraterrestrial. Worse, the fact that this craft and other flying saucers had been surveilling our defensive installations and, listen, even seemed to evidence a technology we'd seen evidenced by the Nazis, caused the military to assume these flying saucers had hostile intentions. Now, I point this quotation out because, on the one hand, Colonel Corso is talking about the absence of evidence, and yet in self-contradictory fashion, he suggests that there's something Nazi-looking about this technology. So let's consider the specific list that he alleges was recovered from this allegedly extraterrestrial craft, and that he then, in turn, gradually seeded into American industry. He talks about lasers, integrated circuits, which implies in the development of the technology tree, transistors, and if you've read Corso, you'll recall that he spends a great deal of time emphasizing the fact that the transistor and its history is rather dubious and suspicious. And he writes it all down to the fact that, well, it ultimately comes from ET. He mentions fiber optics, particle accelerators, and Kevlar, but look at the list. For lasers, we have a 1944 memorandum drawn up by a Luftwaffe scientist that specifically mentions that the project that they're investigating involves the Kaskadenprinzip, the cascade principle, the very principle in use in lasers. As for integrated circuits and transistors, I've shown you that in 1940 they're producing semiconductor wafers, which is an essential step in the technology tree to the transistor. And I've shown you that little miniature klystron tube that resulted from that research, which is definitely, again, a step on the way to the transistor. He mentions fiber optics, but we found in the evidence a document referring to something that the Germans are calling optical telephony. He mentions particle accelerators, and what I didn't mention is that this 1944 Luftwaffe document, the same one that describes the very same principle in use in lasers, mentions the very interesting fact that the way they're going to pump the lasing cavity itself is by use of radio resonance linear particle accelerators. Widerrede accelerators are known as. So in other words, with the exception of lowly Kevlar, all of the other technologies mentioned by Corso as examples of extraterrestrial technology have some clear antecedent in the technology tree that comes from Nazi Germany. To put it succinctly, nothing about the technology mentioned by Corso is exotic enough to be extraterrestrial. But it is exotic enough to be Nazi. Now, what are the implications of this? Why am I bothering to go through all of this exotic technology, all this research? And trust me, friends, we've just barely skimmed the surface. And assume, for the sake of argument, that their atomic bomb program was successful, contrary to everything that you've been told and taught. Assume that for the sake of argument. I argue the case in the first book, incidentally. If none of those technologies warranted the extremely high classification within the Third Reich of Kriegsentscheidend, which means war decisive. Not even the atom bomb merited that classification. Then what did? And the answer, of course, is the Nazi bell. So I'm going to talk about these 9 points in this part of the presentation. And folks, I realize I'm going at breakneck speed here. I did this presentation in Laughlin, Nevada. It took me 3 hours. So you're getting a real Cliff Notes version of this. But we're going to talk about these 9 points. That's why I took five books to tell this story. The bell was codenamed under a variety of names, and its various components or compartments each had different code names. The overall project was called Project Chronos, or Project Time, or depending on how you translate the Greek there, Project Saturn. The power plant for this device was codenamed Projekt Charité Anlage, which was the name of a very famous hospital in Berlin at the time. Now file that code name away, Projekt Charité Anlage, because it is a crucial data point that is going to tell you what happened to the bell after the war. And that's the really bad news, by the way. At some point in the mid-1940s, the Nazis split the project into 2 components, a physics component and a medical component. And we'll find out why in a little bit. But the physics component, after the project was split into these 2 branches, was called Das Laternenträgerprojekt, which means the Lantern Bearer Project, or if you want to translate very loosely, the Light Bearer Project, and extending the metaphor, Project Lucifer. Now, the dimensions and shape of the bell, it's called the bell very obviously because it's shaped like a bell. It stood about 12 to 15 feet high and was about 9 to 12 feet wide. It was made apparently out of either a ceramic material or some sort of ceramic metal. That was the outer casing. And around the outer casing, it had numerous electrical ports for extremely high voltage electricity. Okay, that's your power requirement here, and we're going to see just how enormous it was in just a second. I believe internally, on the inside of this device, there were 2 counter-rotating drums. I believe that those drums were stacked one on top of the other, and this puts me in a different camp than Nick Cook and Igor Witkowski, who have more or less implied that they were one inside the other. I believe they were stacked, and we'll see why again in a moment. Now, near where the bell was tested, the Germans had built an entire electrical power plant, okay, mere hundreds of yards away from the facilities where the bell was tested. It was also nicknamed by the Germans who were involved with the project Der Bienenstock, or the beehive, because it made this hissing, buzzing sound when it was in operation. Now, these 2 clues tell me, the electrical power plant being built so close and the sound that it makes, tell me that the power requirements were for direct current electricity, and they far exceeded the ability of any batteries at that time to produce enough power for this device. In other words, its power requirements are absolutely enormous. Now, into these counter-rotating drums, they put a serum that was codenamed in the literature IRR Serum 525. It was put into these drums, and as the drums were spun up, then, of course, the centrifugal force will take that material and coat the insides of these drums, and it will also, the shear inertial forces will also line up the rotation of all the atoms and molecules in that serum along the same plane of rotation, okay? So the mechanical part of the physics of this device is very, very important. The color of this serum was a kind of a dark reddish maroon purple color. And it was described as being kind of a heavy liquid goo. And more importantly, the man who first discloses the bell to history. We'll find out about him in a few minutes. Also mentions that its recipe consisted of mercury, which of course is a heavy liquid metal, and either thorium or beryllium oxides. Okay? Now store thorium in the back of your mind for a moment, because that's a very, very important point. We'll talk about it in a minute. Finally, the device was cryogenically cooled, either by liquid nitrogen or liquid oxygen. In other words, they got the temperature of this device down as much as they could. It's tested in underground sites and partly above ground on various occasions in a German town called Ludwigsdorf, very remote area of a province of Germany called Silesia. Now, if you don't know where Silesia is, if you look at a pre-war map of Germany, there's kind of a little finger that sticks down between Poland and Czechoslovakia. That's Silesia. Okay, it's kind of a rugged area, rugged, mountainous, and lots of forests. When it was tested underground, it was tested in a room that was lined with ceramic bricks, and these in turn were covered with rubber mats. And after each test of this device, those rubber mats were removed by concentration camp laborers and then burnt, and then the room was scrubbed down with brine. And this suggests that this device is putting out extreme radioactivity, and we'll find out why this is so in a moment. And then, of course, I've mentioned the proximity of an entire electrical power plant at these facilities. Now, the headquarters of the project was here. This is Schloss Fürstenstein, and if you look carefully, you can kind of see it's partly a medieval castle, and then you have some later Renaissance and Baroque additions to it. It sits on a hill, kind of a rugged crag, actually. And beneath this hill here, in this castle, the SS had built a literal rat's run of tunnels and galleries and bunkers and so on. But this is where the headquarters of the Bell project was. This is another part of the facilities where the Bell was tested. I call this the hinge. Igor Vitkovsky and Nick Cook call it the fly trap. But whatever you call it, this is an interesting structure. You can't see it in the picture. It's about 50 feet wide, maybe 30 feet or so tall. This is very heavy reinforced concrete, all of this. And around the ring at the top, there are very heavy-duty steel fasteners that are still there. You can still see these things. Some of them have been actually sheared off, broken off. This whole structure sits in a pool or a basin, you can't see it, that's about 4 feet deep, and then around the outside of this whole structure are, again, ports for heavy-duty electrical cabling. When the Bell was tested outside in this structure, the concentration camp inmates that were at Gross Rosen, which was the camp that supplied the laborers for this project, at night would describe seeing barrel-like devices that were glowing a pale blue glow, ascending above the tree line, and then settling back down below it again. So in other words, you have eyewitness testimony that says that this device levitated. Okay? Now, I'm still laying out all the data points. We'll tie it all together and find out what it means in a moment. There were 3 departments of the SS that were connected with the Bell project. And each of these departments of the SS had extremely high top secret clearances that were necessary to even know about their existence. The first department was called the SS Entwicklungsstelle 4, or Development Area 4. And the mission brief of this department is very interesting. Listen carefully. The mission brief was to make Nazi Germany energy independent by investigating zero-point energy. So this was the department in Nazi Germany that, believe it or not, was in the 1930s and 40s conducting controlled fusion research. The next SS department was what was called the Kammlerstab, or the Kammler Group, or Kammler Staff. Now, this was a top secret weapons think tank that was run by a 4-star SS general by the name of Hans Kammler. He was quite literally, by the end of the war, responsible for all of the Third Reich's secret weapons projects. I mean every last one of them, including the Bell. But again, the mission brief of this group, Kammler had recruited scientists from all over Nazi Germany and then later occupied Europe, and told them an interesting thing. He freed them from the constraints of Nazi Party ideology, and he said, I want you to brainstorm your way to second, third, and fourth generation weapons systems and work out the detailed technology trees from how to get from here to there. And he went further. He created a top secret scientific journal that allowed these scientists to circulate their papers, their research, to each other. So one of the key things about the Kammler Group is that you will find it taking all of these very strange and exotic technologies and combining them in very novel ways. So this is the group that's actually coordinating secret weapons research. The final group of the SS is this department called Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente, or the FEP as it was known. And that simply stands for Research, Development, and Patents. Now, the mission brief of this department of the SS was to scour all of the patent applications inside the Third Reich, and then, of course, later occupied Europe, and to pull any patent that had anything to do with the mission brief of these other two departments, and then pass that patent along to those two departments. Now, one final note. I want to talk about some of the personnel that we know to have been involved with the Bell project. And trust me here, folks, there were at least 60 to 100 scientists and technicians involved with the project, and we know of about 10 of them. That's how tight the security on this thing was. But one person that was involved in the medical aspect of this project, trying to figure out ways to limit the effects of this device on living beings, was the infamous Dr. Hubertus Strugholt. Okay? He was headquartered at Schloss Fürstenstein, and he later is brought to this country as one of the leading scientists helping NASA set up its whole space medicine department. He's one of the Bell scientists. But here's the good news. This fellow here fascinates me. His name is Dr. Kurt Davis. He was a senior flight administrator at Cape Canaveral during the Apollo program. He's standing next to his good friend, you probably all recognize him, Dr. Werner von Braun. And of course, as you can see, they're behind glass, they've got their headphones on, and they're talking about something off in the distance. Well, oops, didn't mean to do that. Who's Dr. Davis? First of all, he's not a rocket scientist at all. His specialty, now remember his position, senior flight administrator during the Apollo program at Cape Canaveral. Incidentally, we know him to have been an ardent Nazi. I won't mention why we know that, but you can find out in the books. Daba's specialty was high voltage direct current and its measurement. And this is the man that worked for a German company called Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, AEG, or the German version, if you will, of General Electric. And this is the man who, under the code name Projekt Charité Anlage, designed the power plant for the Bell. Question: what is this man doing as a senior flight administrator for Apollo? Suggestion: might Apollo have used some technology that they have kept off the books? Answer: yes. But you have to read the books to find out why. Now, this guy, to me, is another one of the interesting characters involved with the Bell project. This is SS Obergruppenführer Emil Matzew. He was the head, equivalent of a four-star general. He was the head of the Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente. This is the guy that's scouring all these patents. Okay? Now, folks, I'm something of a World War II buff. I have studied World War II history, and in particular the European theater of operations, since I was a boy. And I know the General Officer Corps of the major combatants in that war rather well. There's not many names unknown to me, be they American generals or French generals or British generals or German generals or Italian generals or Russian generals, okay? There's not many of them I don't know about. But I can assure you, we'll let the air raid die down here. We're talking about Nazis and the air raid siren. the air raid siren blows, you know. Okay. that was a little synchronous moment. All right. I can assure you that in all of my years of reading World War II, I have never, ever encountered the name of this man. And when you try to investigate him, you find that, yeah, he was the head of the Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente, and you find out nothing else. You don't know where he was born. You don't know where he died. You don't know where he went after the war, if he survived the war. You can find out literally nothing about this man. Now, I want to talk a bit about what I call the unholy trinity, because there's three names in connection with the Bell project I want you to bear in mind. The first one is this gentleman, loosely using that term here, SS Obergruppenführer Dr. Engineer Hans Kammler. In Germany, you can get doctorates in engineering, folks. This is the man that's actually the head of that think tank research group called the Kammlerstab. And incidentally, he's also head of the SS Building and Works Department, and incidentally, this is the same man that designed Auschwitz. As head of the SS Building and Works Department, just remember what one of the parts of the Allied legend about German nuclear incompetence during the war is. Well, the Germans never got the bomb because they didn't have enough money and they didn't have enough manpower. Look at what we did in the Manhattan Project. We had 60,000 people working on that, and we kept it secret. As head of the SS Buildings and Works Department, and also as head of all of Nazi Germany's secret weapons research, including the Bell, including the atomic bomb, and so on and so forth, General Kammler could call on a slave labor pool of approximately 14 million people. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is that this man is in charge of a secret weapons project group that is mega Manhattan Project sized. And incidentally, the Bell we never heard about or learned about during the war. It was only with German reunification that the first part of this story really began to break. Now, why was it so secret? Well, here's the fellow that provides the answer, another lovely man by the name of Heinrich Müller, also known as Gestapo Müller. This is the man who is the actual head of the Gestapo, and he was personally responsible for the triple belt of political, economic, and industrial counterintelligence around the Kammlerstab and all of its associated projects. So in other words, you had at one time during the war literally about 7,500 Gestapo agents around all of these projects, sniffing the ground, antenna pulsing with suspicion, snooting out any possibility that these most advanced projects were being penetrated. And here's the final character in our unholy trinity. This is Nazi Party Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. He's the actual head of the Nazi Party for most of the war after Rudolf Hess takes that unusual flight to the United Kingdom. It's Bormann who replaces him. It is Bormann who transfers to General Kammler's jurisdiction at the end of the war Kampfgeschwader 200, which is a special unit of the Luftwaffe that was responsible for all of the covert and special missions of the Luftwaffe. It's this unit that had control of all of Nazi Germany's ultra long-range heavy lift aircraft. Okay? And it was most likely Martin Bormann who ordered the execution of 60 of the Bell's project scientists and technicians at the end of the war. Think of Martin Bormann as Dick Cheney. Think of him as Dick Cheney without the warmth and charm. Okay? This incident is the signal that Martin Bormann clearly intends for this project to remain unknown to the Western Allies or to the Soviet bloc. So stop and consider. I believe it's the Nazis driving that technological division at the end of the spoils, and he's driving it in a very clever way. He's seeing to it that the United States and the Soviet Union get roughly an equal division of the technological spoils, the rockets, the jets, the computers. And if you read my books, he gives crucial atomic bomb components to the Manhattan Project, to the United States, in what can only be described as one of the most Byzantine deals made at the end of the war. But the Bell, he keeps to themselves. So, in my book, Secrets of the Unified Field, I wrote about these three men, and I'll read it to you, because it is my firm conviction, and I make the case in those books, that these three men escaped Nazi Germany. Bormann, Müller, and Kammler. It is an interesting and unholy trinity to contemplate, for in it, one discerns the outlines of a very sinister shadow. The shadow of a post-war Nazi international beginning to emerge. Consider, if there was to be a post-war Nazi international continuing to develop its own secret projects, it would need lots of money and someone who knew how to handle it, Bormann, or Dick Cheney without the warmth and charm. It would need lots of security and someone who knew how to run it. Miller. And it would need lots of engineering expertise and management experience in coordinating large projects and keeping them secret. Kammler. And they would need a suitably advanced project to work on within the limits imposed by post-war circumstances. Large uranium enrichment plants for A-bombs were out, as were large and very visible rocket gantries. Something truly sensational, which would not require large physical plants other than large power supplies, and which would pay much larger dividends than any of the other above alternatives was needed. The Bell. So what's the basis of this project? The basis in theoretical physics, I'm glad Dr. Brandenburg was here talking about Kaluza-Klein theory, because this is the German mathematician Theodor Franz Edward Kaluza, who was the first man to publish one of these hyperdimensional unified field theories in the year 1921, and it's a five-dimensional theory, just exactly like Dr. Brandenburg said. And it does unify electromagnetism and gravity. Now listen carefully, my friends, because modern theoretical physics, if you listen to Coast AM, you might have heard Dr. Michio Kaku talk on occasion, the founder of the absurdly over-dimensionalized string theory, okay? But if you listen to these theoretical physicists explain why these unified theories were unsuccessful, they will tell you exactly what Dr. Brandenburg told you, is that they did not attempt to incorporate quantum mechanics into these theories, and therefore, theoretically, they're incomplete. But here's the key point. The key point is this man here, Gabriel Krohn. Most of you have probably never heard of him. He's a Hungarian Jewish man. He was an electrical engineering genius, okay? And he won a paper in 1935. He wins the Montefiore Prize at the University of Liège in Belgium, which of course is just across the border from Germany. But in the paper, he says that we electrical engineers can explain the anomalies that we see, the phase creep and so on and so forth, in large networked rotating electrical systems by means of these hyperdimensional unified field theories that were being written publicly in Nazi Germany and even before that in the Weimar Republic from 1921 up to about 1933. Okay? Now stop and consider, friends, what he's just told you. Because what he's just said, if you look at it carefully, is that with common, everyday, ordinary 1935 technology and electrical circuits, that the fabric of space-time is engineerable locally on the laboratory bench. In other words, those theories, Dr. Kaku, may be incomplete, but they're engineerable. And it's very interesting because at that moment, across the border in Nazi Germany, open publication of unified field theory literature in the physics literature completely stops. Remember that man, Emil Matsuf, heading that patent research department? Now, why is he so significant? Well, he ends up in the United States of America working for General Electric. And rest assured that across the border in Nazi Germany, they were paying very close attention to what he had said in that paper. This man, incidentally, ends up working for General Electric. I believe you all know about experiments that the Navy alleges never happened, trying to make ships invisible to radar. There he is. Now, the third component leading to the data that we have to assemble in the Bell project is this man here, SS Brigadeführer Karl Maria Willegut. He's also known by the names Weistor or Jarl Vidar. He was a very famous occultist and esotericist in Europe between the wars. He's also nicknamed Himmler's Rasputin. Okay, so if you can imagine Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, having his own personal occult guru, this is the guy. Now, Willegut's cosmology is this here. This is actually a reproduction from one of his little occult papers. And I'm going to read this little quotation over here. You can kind of follow along with me as he's discussing what these spirals mean. He says, quote, "Primal law, above is below, below is above. Therefore, in the middle, there is a neutral force." Remember, Dr. Brandenburg, three-phase Tesla vortex? 3, not 2. From the 2 spirals, in other words, that third force comes out of a counter-rotating system, sound like the bell, and is connected by the generational plane. The middle field is developed the world egg. Now, what does this mean? The fabric of space-time is not a mere void, but an information-creating field using structures of rotation, which are creating information by creating systems of rotation within systems of rotation within systems, and you get the point. In other words, we're talking about torsion. Now, what's torsion? Think of an empty soda can. Take it in your hands and wring it like the dish can, or like a dish rag, right? That counter-rotating motion will spiral and fold and pleat the can, and the can represents space-time. That's what torsion does to space-time. So in other words, of necessity, this whole physics is hyperdimensional because Kaluza-Klein's theory geometrically is a cylinder. That 5th dimension is a tiny little curled up dimension. So the whole geometry of the theory is a cylinder. That's why I think those counter-rotating drums inside the bell were stacked one on top of the other. And this physics has been staring us in the face, my friends, with the, so to speak, the corporate logo of the Nazi Party. Because if you look at the swastika like a physicist would look at the swastika, or look even at Karl Maria Willegut's esoteric writings like a physicist would look at them, what do you have? You have a vector diagram. And you have a subsystem of rotation and a subsystem of stress. And that, incidentally, if you were following Dr. Brandenburg carefully, was exactly what he was talking about. Now, its observed effects were that on plants, any plants exposed to this device would decay within a matter of mere minutes, or sometimes hours, depending on the exposure, to a kind of blackish gray goo. I'm removing as fast as I can, David. A blackish gray goo without putrefaction. Its effect on humans was that in its first test, it killed 7 of the scientists involved. It was observed to levitate by concentration camp inmates. All of these effects are condign to a severe torsion shear. So let's look at what we have. Let's sum up all these data points to see what they're up to. I don't believe the dimensions of the device have any functional purpose. The cryogenic cooling, incidentally, is interesting because that lowers electrical resistance almost to the point of 0. So in other words, all that electrical rotation taking place in the system is almost superconductive. And superconductivity, again, was part of the physics literature of the period. The stacked counter-rotating drums with that serum in it, torsion shear. That serum, which is made out of mercury and thorium, you'll recall. Let's discuss thorium briefly. When the American intelligence teams went into the Third Reich at the end of the war, they discovered an anomaly which to this day has never been explained. And that is that the Nazis were stockpiling massive amounts of thorium, and nobody at that time had a clue what in the world they were doing with it. Well, thorium has an interesting isotope called thorium-229 isomer. An isomer is simply an isotope that the nucleus of the atom is in a state of extremely high spin, okay? But imagine it like a merry-go-round. If you de-excite, or in other words, suddenly stop that merry-go-round from its high state of spin, what will it do? It'll fly apart if you stop it fast enough. Thorium-229 just happens to have a very low threshold of excitation. In other words, it doesn't take much to cause it to fly apart. Okay? So when they're electrically pulsing that thorium, with all of that electrical power, and it's in this high state of spin, it's releasing tremendous amounts of radiation. Remember Dr. Brandenburg and that radiation pressure controlling fusion? That in turn creates a plasma in the device. As the plasma is driven inward with that electrical arc, it begins to cancel out the magnetic field and create a push, and up she goes. Okay? In other words, I'm telling you that the Nazis have rationalized this device to the nth degree. And thorium-229 isomer could only be isolated by, guess what? Laser isotope separation. This is a huge project, and it's rationalized to the last detail. And finally, I didn't really talk much about it, but they're using two kinds of electrical potential, alternating and direct current. And again, that's for the purpose of creating electrical stress and shear in this rotating system. So, what's the purpose? We can theorize that what the bell it is a device, an intentionally designed hyperdimensional device to tap into those five-dimensional characteristics of the fabric of space-time itself via that whole concept of the rotation of that fifth dimension. Okay? Thus, if this technology is successful, it leads simultaneously and at one and the same time to three things. Please understand that. Okay? It will lead to so-called free or zero-point energy technology. There's your energy independence for Nazi Germany. That's why that SS department is involved with this Bell project. Secondly, it leads to anti-gravity field propulsion, as we've seen with the levitation. And finally, here's the bad news, folks. If you weaponize this technology, you have your hands on a weaponization potential that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a kitchen match. That's why the Nazis classify this as kriegsentscheidend, far above a mere atomic bomb. Now, where did it go? We know about the Bell story because of this man here. This is SS Obergruppenführer Jakob Sporenberg. This is the man that was tasked by Martin Bormann with murdering the 60 scientists and technicians at the end of the war to prevent them from falling into Soviet or Allied hands and talking about it. So in other words, again, Bormann clearly intends this project to remain absolutely secret and out of Allied hands. We know about it because Sporenberg was actually tried for these crimes by a Polish war crimes trial, and the affidavit, as the Iron Curtain collapsed, then came out into the public. That's why we know about this project at all. Now, as I noted, Bormann gave control of Luftwaffe Kampfgeschwader 200, which had control of Germany's ultra-heavy lift long-range aircraft, to General Kammler right toward the end of the war. Here you see one of them. This is a Junkers 6-engine 390, okay? This is an aircraft, listen carefully, that number one was one of the first aircraft in the world to be designed for mid-air refueling. Surprise! But also, even without that, this aircraft is capable of flying non-stop from Nazi Germany to Argentina. The last picture, incidentally, of a Junkers 390 was taken in Prague, where General Kammler's group was headquartered. This is Dr. Ronald Richter, with his little baby daughter at the time. He was the head of a secret fusion project in Argentina that was being sponsored by General Juan Perón, who at the time was, of course, the dictator of Argentina. And Perón inadvertently revealed the existence of this project when apparently Richter had some phenomenal test results. He shared them with General Perón, and Perón immediately called a press conference and announced to the world that Argentina had discovered the secret of the hydrogen bomb. Okay, this was before we had even exploded our own. Now, needless to say, Richter was roundly denounced in the American and British press for being a fraud. Okay? But 4 years later, very quietly, the United States Air Force sends people down to contact Richter because Perón has basically placed the man under house arrest in Buenos Aires. And trust me here, I'm skipping enormous amounts of this story. You have to read the book. But Perón had placed this man under house arrest, and the project, I believe, was closed down by the Nazis who were actually running it and moved elsewhere. Okay? That's the nutshell. But what Richter actually told the Americans was, I wasn't really doing nuclear fusion research at all, because in my research in Nazi Germany during 1936, I discovered a phenomenon that when plasmas are driven by shock waves, they seem to transduce more energy than you're putting into the plasma from the shock wave. In other words, Richter thought that a rotating stressed plasma would transduce the zero-point energy. So he told his American interrogators, that's what I was really investigating down here. But looky, looky. When Richter worked in Nazi Germany on this plasma research, look who he worked for. The Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft. The same company that built the power plant for the Bell. And incidentally, he's working for this company that built the power plant for the Bell at the same time. And therefore, that would have meant he was working under Dr. Kurt Davis. Looky, looky. Additionally, Richter was working on a project that was codenamed Projekt Charité Anlage, which was one of the project code names for the Bell's power plant. In other words, friends, contrary to Nick Cook and Igor Witkowski, the United States of America and Great Britain didn't get the Bell. It went to Argentina. And it was, here's the bad news, it was real, honest to goodness, quite alive Nazis that were working on it. And we don't know what they did with it after they moved the project away from Perón's hands. And if that's not enough to convince you. This is a picture that was taken by one of my sources, a U.S. lieutenant commander from the U.S. Navy that's now retired. His name is Harry Cooper. He has a kind of a group of World War II veterans from all nations from their naval forces that get together and meet and discuss the war, including a lot of German naval veterans. But this is a photo that they took outside the remains of one of Dr. Richter's laboratories that Perón had built for him 900 miles out in the middle of nowhere southwest of Buenos Aires in Rio Negro province of Argentina, near a little town called San Carlos de Bariloche. And look what his Argentine guide is standing next to large metal drums. Remember those counter-rotating metal drums in the bell? And incidentally, looky, they have a shaft through them. And no one to this day knows what Richter was doing with these drums. People think, well, these were somehow fuel rod ports for a reactor. Well, I don't think so, because no reactor would require this sort of clumsy arrangement, at least not that at that day. So, final point. Where did it go? What's the rest of the story? Well, we simply do not know what happened to the bell after it was shut down, most likely by the Nazis themselves in Argentina in 1951. Richter, having been exposed, is basically cashiered by Bormann and Company, placed under house arrest and washed by Perón, and the project went we know not where. But rest assured, given the physics that was involved and what they were doing with it and attempting to achieve, rest assured that somebody, somewhere, kept working on it. There you are.